They are doing incredible work, and I'm so, so proud to have Meghan here today. She in her career has been a communications director, a chief creative officer. She even founded a boutique agency at one point. She's been a writer, she's been a film critic, but right now she's here to talk to you about brand marketing. And we're so, so pleased to have her. So please give her a warm welcome back to the JumpCon stage.
Thank you so much. Awkward handoff. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here. Apologies if you're not properly caffeinated. Hopefully I can keep you entertained for the next 30 minutes. So yeah, I wanted to talk today about audience and how to develop audience. You know, there's this idea, if you build it, they will come. But is that true today? I'm going to talk a little bit about attention, the attention economy, give some branded content examples, talk through whether you should build or borrow an audience, and show you some examples of our work at T-Brand, where we've done a little bit of both. Let me see, am I moving here? There we go. So attention. For the last few years, we've been talking about the attention economy. And there's this stat about us having a shorter attention span than a goldfish. Have any of you heard this, that we have now 8-second attention span, so you have really limited time to capture people's attention? I love this stat, especially because it has this sense of truthiness. It sort of took off like wildfire. But in reality, it was a study done by Microsoft of about 200 Canadians, and it's not actually true. If you think about the way it's used often when it comes up, people are talking about how our attention spans are dwindling and getting slower, shorter and shorter and shorter, so you have to do something that's going to be really outrageous to stop people in their tracks where they're scrolling. But the reality is that user preferences are not linear. We're not going for shorter and shorter content, although in certain channels that's what people expect. Overall, we're seeing that long-form content is actually very successful. We've got 150 million podcasts people are listening to every single month. 94% of top executives are reading newsletters. These are formats that you'd think would be on life support or gone completely by now. And if you look at top performing search results, the average word count is 2,000 words, which actually seems really long when you're thinking about the way we're formatting content for social media. And although, your sales reps might be getting dumber, unfortunately, audiences are not getting dumber. They're actually just getting better at avoiding distractions. And they can quickly notice if something is not of interest to them, and they scroll right past it. The good news is that content marketing is working for a lot of brands. These stats are pretty well known. Content marketing generates 3 times as many leads as traditional marketing. 82% of consumers have a positive opinion about a company after reading custom content. And 72% of customers believe they have a relationship with a brand from custom content. That's great news if you're in the business of creating content, and increasingly brands are. So 91% of B2B marketers use content marketing. That seems great, especially I'm in the business of creating content marketing, so it's excellent for us. Unfortunately, the results do not match the amount of effort being put in. If you look at this, only 20% of marketers say that their content is very successful. And 53% say they're moderately successful. It's really not great to hear when you see how much people are investing in content right now. And if you look around, brands are increasingly becoming publishers. These are just a few examples. You've got Casper had a site called Van Winkle's. Marriott was creating a Medium blog called Gone. Coca-Cola has done a lot of content marketing, and this one's my favorite. I don't know if any of you have heard of SugarString. It was a site launched by Verizon, and the ambition was to cover news and technology, not talking about the brand at all, but really they hired reporters. They had a whole team of writers and editors focused on breaking news and what they could talk about in the space. Unfortunately, about a week in, they launched a piece that was not, didn't have permission to write, and the whole site was shut down within a month of launch, which is not great. And increasingly, you can see there's a lot of news and a lot of coverage when a new brand launches a content site, but then we don't always hear much from it afterwards. Brands are really thinking about that traditional PR model. All their efforts are focused on launch. They create content ongoing, but they're not getting attention past that initial push. And part of the reason is because they're thinking about publishing in a traditional model that doesn't really work today. A lot of content sites are built on this idea of habitual readership, where readers are going to come back to your site on a daily basis or a weekly basis, but that's just not how customers or readers are thinking anymore. So, if you're an established publisher, you might have someone typing in your URL in their website, but more often people are going to find content where they already are, in social, if it's being shared by their friends. And so we have to really rethink how brand publishing works today to have success. And everyone knows about banner blindness. Users increasingly just ignore advertising. If you look at those heat maps of how users scroll on a page, you can see that anything that's in a box that can be identified as advertising is immediately ignored. That's pretty common knowledge now. But the thing that we're not thinking about is that if you're treating content like an ad, people are going to ignore that too. And too often, brands are busy talking about themselves in their content, which ends up being a really long ad, and that's not what people want to see. And it's as much as we're seeing that there are long-form content options that people really like to read and watch and listen to, there's so much competition today. If you look through, that's 8 billion video views on Facebook every day. The amount of indexed web pages on Google is 130 trillion. So if you're just starting out trying to create SEO content, that's what you're competing against. There's a lot of information out there. And even if you build great content, there's no guarantee that people will see it. How many of you are creating custom content or working with a team that creates custom content? You know how much effort it takes just to get live? Like the amount of time and effort you put into something, you want people to see it and love it. I remember when I used to be a writer, I had an editor who worked with Bob Novak, and he used to share this all the time. Novak was a very well-known editorial writer and the host of Crossfire. And whether you agree with his politics or not, this is always a funny thing that really stuck in my head. He said that when publishing an op-ed is a lot like peeing in a dark suit. It feels good for a minute and then nobody notices. So I don't think that he loved peeing in a dark suit. His idea there, and something that you can, I used to always notice in his op-eds, and whether you'd agreed with them or not, he was always breaking news and interviewing people and bringing new information out in his op-eds. So it wasn't just his opinion on something that was happening in the world. He was sharing new information so that he was connecting to the audience. And I think that's really important and something that we're forgetting about a lot of the time. But even if you have a great story, you still have to think about how people are going to get to it. And I think about this sort of in the concept of building or borrowing an audience. And there are benefits to both. If you're thinking about building direct content on your website, you get to have this direct relationship with your audience. You get to have those users in your ecosystem, which is invaluable, and you have more control of the user journey and access to data. If you're going to borrow audiences from a partner or an advertiser, you get that fire hose of viewers. It's really easy to get put into their ecosystem. Their audience behavior is already established, so you don't have to teach new audiences to do something different on your website, and you get this great amplification opportunity. However, there are also drawbacks for both. So if you're just starting out creating content, it's going to be a really steep uphill climb to develop an audience, and you do need to think about spending money to drive acquisition. And I think when you're very first starting out, it's hard to know what the metrics of success are. And meanwhile, if you're borrowing audience, you're beholden to the platform rules. You have to be in their format. You have to often use creative that makes sense on that platform. You're competing with all the other brands in that ecosystem, and you're giving up a lot of ownership from the users. And if you're trying to decide if you want to do storytelling on someone else's platform or on your own, I think there are a few criteria that are important to keep in mind. For your own site, you want to make sure you have a clear and ownable point of view. And thinking through your keyword space, it's best when it's uncrowded if you can come up with something that actually ties to places where you're already ranking on your products and find something that has a new way in that you can start to develop stories around. And you have to think about ongoing content production. I think that's what really gets a lot of brands, is they think about how they'll get started and they put a lot of effort into that initial approach, but then you have to keep it going. You know, I often say that building publishing for a brand is like getting a puppy. They're really cute when you first get them home, and then all of a sudden you realize you have to keep watering and feeding them and paying attention to them, and that's something that gets forgotten a lot. But if you're going to be borrowing audience, you really want to think through what is that budget that you're going to allocate, what are the actionable goals, and then how are you aligning, what are you giving the audience that makes sense for where they are in that moment, and does your creative align to the placement that you're using? For us, we always think about both building and borrowing. So I create content mostly off the New York Times platform for brands. And the thing that's really nice, you know, I was at ad agencies before this, and we were in the business of creating beautiful content, and then we have to hand over to a media partner. For T-Brand, we have that arm for distribution built in, which is really helpful. But still, anytime you're building content, you want to know what the competitive landscape, what your competitors are doing, where there's a white space for content, and what your point of view is, so that you can build off of the target keyword list. And I think this is the most important thing. Don't try to boil the ocean. When you think through what content you could be writing about, if you try and cover off everything, it's a lot harder to have impact versus focusing on a few topics where you know your users have questions they want information on, and building out a package of content that's going to be relevant for their needs. And then there are a few ways to borrow audiences. Obviously, you can rent an audience with a media partner or a platform. If there's someone out there that's already doing exactly what your brand wants to be doing, there's opportunity to buy them and bring that in-house. Also, I think a great option that people don't always think about is co-creating. If you have shared interests and shared topics with a brand that's in your space or related to your space, building that content together, or even with individual creators and influencers. And then there's always the opportunity to do something really interesting that's going to generate PR. But it always starts with the story. I mean, I'm a former journalist. That's always where I'm going to start. But you want to make sure that you're thinking about the users and what they're doing and how you can drive a relationship that's not just speaking at the people you want to reach. And think about what your brand has authority on so that you can have a point of view that is going to be different and show how you are separate from your competitors. Obviously, you want to think about putting it in the right time and the right place. And there should always be something original, even if you have budget to create a lot of content. If you're creating something exactly the same as other content that's already out there, you're going to be wasting your time. So for us, we always think about how we can start finding a story for our brands. A lot of companies spend time thinking about what their brand authority is, which is great. Knowing who you are, what you mean in the world, and what your worldview is super important. But you also need to think about what's going on in the culture, what people are watching, what they're thinking about, and figuring out where those two things come together to create work that matters. When you're thinking about everything your brand could produce, there's probably a ton of topics that you have authority over, but you really want to find that kind of slice where you know that people are looking for information on the topic that you can have something to say about. For T-Brand, the way we get to our content and thinking about distribution, we're starting with the story. We go to story making where we're producing creative, but even from the beginning, we're thinking about where it will be living and how it's expressed in the world. And for us, defining that narrative point of view that can fuel all the stories the brand has to tell really helps to not only inform the content you make, but the content that you don't make. And I think that's something that people don't always focus on. But when you think about traditional media and brands that are successful, it's clear what makes a Wired story, what makes a Wirecutter story, what would go on Martha Stewart versus Epicurious. For brands, because they're not traditionally publishers, they don't always think about kind of what box they play in, and helping to inform not only the content team, but also your partners within distribution and media to help you figure it out. And then once you've defined that story, it becomes really easy to continue production and make stories and think about how it'll be expressed in the world. And obviously, distribution matters. When you're starting out, thinking about the specific story you're trying to tell in order to understand where it should live in the world, where you want, what partners you want to work with, and also what attention you think you'll get from other press and media. And this is, I think, an important thing that people forget. A lot of times when you're focused on the funnel, brands will think about the top of the funnel and awareness, or the bottom of the funnel and really focus on product content and SEO. But actually, omni-channel marketing really does work. And you can see that when you're spending money on awareness, people are going to search for your brand more. So it's important not to forget about that. So when you're starting figuring out how you're going to get where you're going, you want to have a destination in mind. Everything we do starts with the audience. And when we're figuring out what the right point of view, what the story should be, we want to also really key in tightly on what the audience is that they're going for, where that audience is, and how they can be reached. Also, thinking through goals and measurement, I think something that gets forgotten a lot is brands are thinking about what their objectives are, but they're not always tying their KPIs to those objectives. If you're going to be using formats that are for brand awareness, you can't expect to get lead gen from those placements. And then production, I think a really important thing, and this came up in the previous talk, is thinking about any assets that your creators can bring to the table. If there's an influencer you can partner with who already has an audience that you want to reach, that can be a great way to get your message across. We do a lot of work with micro-influencers who have really tight relationships with their specific audience, and we found that going a few tiers down from really big name influencers can be really helpful when you have that clear target of what the audience is that you want to reach. And then think about how your assets are going to show up in the world. If you're going to produce a long form piece of content but you want it to live on social, build those assets into your production so they can be plug and play where they need to go. And then, been doing this for a while, and I think there are a lot of things that can be problematic when you're trying to get content out the door at a brand. Having buy-in from different groups is really important, and it's tough when you're a small content team and the budgets aren't within your team. And also, a lot of times, the focus will be on either distribution or production, but you really want to think holistically from the beginning before you start out. Measurement, I think it's true. We have a ton of data and we don't know what to do with it. Thinking through the ways you can measure success for exactly what your goal is really important. And making sure you have the right team to produce the kind of content that you want to get out into the world. And this is just something that you're always going to hear from a journalist, but you want to be telling a great story, not just talking about yourself. And increasingly, we've seen for content to be successful, you need to have all of leadership aligned on what you're getting out the door. And too often, the marketing team or the comms team that's creating the content is not tightly connected to the product team, the research team, all the places in the company where you can find really interesting stories. They're not communicating, which can be really problematic. And for us, we're always thinking about how our stories are going to be shared and thinking through what that message is and what that audience is that you're trying to reach, then figuring out where it will live based on the story that you want to tell. And for us, that can be a brand newsroom on a client's owned and operated channels. obviously, we spend a lot of time creating content for New York Times Media. We also have an experiential agency that's amazing. We do a lot of custom podcasts. As I said earlier, podcasts are a great way to get your story out, especially if you can figure out that intersection of what your audience is interested in and what you can tell. For B2B, you know, this shift that we've been seeing and that we've been advocating for a long time is that B2B audiences are still people. They still have stories that they want to hear. So figuring out what that story is, audio can be a great way to reach them. And then events, you know, figuring out how you can be sharing new information in a live setting like this one, super important. So I wanted to show you a few examples of how this has come to life, and then we can have a conversation, hopefully. So one brand that we've been working with is Calvin Klein. Maybe this will date me, but I don't know how many of you remember, you know, Kate Moss and Marky Mark in their underwear in those campaigns. The brand has a really successful formula, which is celebrity, self-expression, and provocation. The way that they've defined those three things has been really important for building their brand over time. But what we realized when we started working with them is that the audience has evolved beyond the sort of top level definition of those three things. And putting someone in their underwear today doesn't have the same impact as it did in the 90s when they were, you know, seen as the brand of a generation. For us, what they tasked us with is figuring out how they can move from just a famous brand to a favorite brand with this younger audience. And when we went in, we did a lot of research on Gen Z to see how they were interacting with brands. And one of the things that we saw is that they don't really want to hear directly from brands. They don't really care about celebrities as much as they care about sort of lookalikes and live-alikes who are like them being represented in media. And so what we did was we went through and found people who had audiences that they'd already developed on social media and had them become our storytellers. So we created some really beautiful content around all of the topics that Calvin has sort of been touching on over the years, and let people tell their story to their audiences, and then shared that on social media, which was really great. We also have content that drives to the site from New York Times Media, and what we saw was that we had 99% positive engagement for having stories where people were really just saying, you know, what creativity means to them, what love means to them, and broadening Calvin's definition of celebrity for today's audience. Also, interestingly, we were able to put up their brand content against our editorial content on the New York Times, and we saw that 78% higher engagement than our general benchmark with these stories told in people's own voices for the brand. This is another one that's really interesting. Shiseido has a number of really interesting technical products they're putting out into the world. They're actually able to use facial recognition software to find out if your skin is oily or dry. They have a smart bottle cap that tells you how much product you need, and a lot of really interesting stuff. And they came to us, you know, wanting more people to see what they had to offer, and we quickly realized that the right execution for them was going to be in the world with our experiential agency. And they had this beautiful store that they've been swapping out creative about once a month, where they wanted people in the door to use the product and see how great it was and how much it could change their face and their success rates with the products. And so what we did, Fake Love, our agency, built out this whole experience in a very popular neighborhood in Tokyo. But also, to get the word out, they sent these beautiful invitations to a number of influencers across Asia, some of whom were never going to be at the event, but they shared it with their audience. And so it had this great halo effect. And you know, in the store, we saw tons of people going through, coming back. You know, 98% of the attendees engaged with the elements that were related to the product, but it was all about creativity, and the story of creativity was then shared and had a halo effect with the people that we invited. Another one is this audio project that we did with GE. GE came to us and they had been losing equity and relevance, and they wanted to get more attention for all of the innovative work that they were doing. And this is one of those things where they had great initiatives, they were investing in all the right places, but people had heard that story before. So we wanted to think about how we could engage audiences in a new way. And we actually developed this whole package with the newsroom for the magazine that was an audio issue. And we had 11 stories covering all different audio experiences. And 3 of those happened to be GE stories. And we sent reporters and videographers all over the world to record the sounds of GE innovation on the ground, and then subscribers of the magazine could see in the print publication what was going on, but also we had an audio app to kind of evolve the experience, and it was super successful. For this one, let me see. Oh, there you go. This is Jake Silverstein, our magazine editor. And it was great results. We saw that users spent 130% more time with the Voyages experience than the average New York Times article, which is already, we have great retention and readership, so it was excellent. And then the last one, just wanted to talk about, we do still do brand publishing for our clients, and HP is one of those clients. We went in and we saw that actually people don't always think of HP as the biggest innovator today, but they have the original birth of Silicon Valley. Their company started in a garage and was the first one to do so. And so we created this site with them called The Garage, where we talk about tech and innovation, not about HP itself, but what is happening in the world, because they're constantly evolving their products. And we also create content on the New York Times to engage and share the stories that we have with The Garage. In the next few weeks, you'll see in the print publication on the weekends, we have some really interesting offline exercises and creative elements for the puzzles that are created with HP, and also just encouraging audiences to go offline and spend more time with their family, which is a really interesting story for HP. But I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions if anybody had any. So yeah. Anyone? I won't bite, I promise. Yeah.
One of the things I really like that you said in terms of creating content that don't boil the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go into a little detail as an emerging brand, as a brand starting out, like how do you pinpoint where to start? Right? You don't want to do everything at once, but like what are the steps to figure out, where to start and how to get that out there in the best way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that it's really important to understand your audience's user journey and how they're interacting with your brand, and what are the triggers and questions that they have where you can bring them in, and figure out a package of content that can be really informationally deep to help them kind of solve those problems, and also position your brand in a really nice way. What we've found is that sometimes a quiz can be a really interesting way to bring people into your ecosystem. If you know that that users are searching a question that's very relevant to your product offering, figuring out how you can help them decide what type of product they need to use, and then having a deep kind of library of content around those topics that's not necessarily promoting your products, but showing them, giving them those answers that they're looking for in search, and then building off from there. Mm-hmm. Cool. Oh, I think it was over there.
Hi, I was just wondering, what's the process into the storytelling process?
The storytelling process?
Yeah.
So for us, we always start with the brand story. So a lot of times, our clients have kind of their product story or their brand story, which is all about them. We spend a lot of time thinking about how that connects to the broader world. So we're looking at, the competitive landscape, the culture, and the audience to see what is missing in the world that people are looking for, and what can be really ownable for that brand to figure out what they should be talking about. The way I think about it, as I said earlier, for publishers, there's always like an angle on a story, and every brand has a personality that can be expressed through content. So really figuring out what that specific story is, and then thinking about what the expression of it can be on the topics that you want to cover. Cool. Well, I think I'm out of time, so thank you so much. It's great.